Good morning and welcome to this CGI Thought Leadership Panel session with CyNam. Today we'll be discussing the concept of language in the cybersecurity industry. Can the language we use advance our technological ambitions, or does it confuse the solutions in cybersecurity? We've got a fantastic panel here today, and I'm going to ask them each to introduce themselves in one moment. But thank you so much to the panel. We're looking forward to exploring this difficult and often obfuscated, there's a good use of language, theme. But let's kick off. If you'd like to introduce yourselves. Shall we start with Lauren?
Thanks, Chris. CEO of Bamboo Technology. So we are a telecoms and IT provider who offer.
Thank you, Lauren. Brilliant. And we've got Will Dickinson from CGI as well. Welcome, Will.
Morning. I'm Will. I've been working for CGI for about 18 months. I work as a technology consultant in IT infrastructure.
Fantastic. Thank you, Will. We've got Andrew Gawasak. Good morning, Andrew.
Good morning. Good afternoon to everyone else. My name is Andrew Gawasak. I'm the president and a co-founder of TrustStamp. We have a headquarters here in Atlanta, which is where I'm based, but we also have a headquarters in Cheltenham and Hub 8. So it's great to join everybody.
Fantastic. Thanks. Paul Harris. Paul, are you here?
Yes, good morning. My name is Paul Harris. I work for Coacto, which is a Salesforce.com CRM consultancy, and I am the founder and principal consultant.
Fantastic. Welcome, Paul. Morgan. Good morning, Morgan.
Hi guys, senior defence consultant with CGI based out of the Innovation Centre at Gloucester. I've been with the company for a year.
Fantastic. And last but very much not least, Paul Earnshaw. Paul, good morning.
Good morning. I'm a technical director with CGI. I've been with CGI for 16 years.
That's all we need to know. Well done. Thank you, Paul. Well, welcome all. Let's crack on. So the first question I've got for you, and it's a very wide-ranging question, really. Do we think the language used in cybersecurity is effective and appropriate, or do we have a problem here? Lauren, why don't we start with you?
Thanks for throwing that first one over to me, Chris. I think it's quite challenging. There's five of us, myself and it's quite interesting. So we are all operating in the industry. However, there's a lot of terminology expressed when we have presentations from exterior shapes what the latest and greatest products and services are. All of the terminology that isn't understood. I don't know how you break that down, really, but I think it's something that we definitely need to be thinking about. Because otherwise, I think there is a natural assumption for everybody knows what everything means. And I think rather than alienate yourself, you actually typically in a meeting will just nod your head. I think it's quite rare to come across people who will ask the question, what does that mean? And actually probably for fear of having to stop somebody on a regular basis when you're talking about anything that's sort of cyber related. You don't really want to kind of stop people in their tracks every 30 seconds, but there's so much terminology. And so many acronyms that, unless you're completely embedded in it, you've been educated in it, you've been surrounded by it for a very long period of time, it's confusing. And yes, I think we're probably all guilty, those of us who are not in that space, who don't have that knowledge, of simply nodding our heads for fear of embarrassment or alienation from it.
It's very difficult not to, isn't it? Because sort of saying, hold on a minute, I don't quite get you. I don't quite follow you there. That can be difficult from senior executives to anybody within a business, really. I'm going to ask the same question to Andrew. Andrew, TrustStamp, deeply technical business, doing some fantastic work in the cybersecurity arena. Do we have a problem with the language used in cybersecurity? Is it enabling us to be better at what we do?
Yeah, it's interesting. So, being somewhat new to the cybersecurity space myself, one of the things that I've noticed talking with, the veterans of the industry is that, cybersecurity has only really jumped into the mainstream in, call it the last 15, maybe 20 years. Whereas before that, they were all kind of shoved in the back, told to just do their job and mostly ignored by, you know, the rest of the business. And so now there's kind of been this reckoning with, you know, kind of things like, you know, hacks and breaches and whatever sensational language the media uses to describe them coming to the forefront of the public's mind. So now there's kind of this reckoning, whereas, you know, they were shoved to the back, they were told to just develop their own language and do their job. You now have this kind of reckoning where you have to communicate it to the rest of the world and communicate it to some very, very non-technical people. So I don't think there's a problem per se. You know, industry experts in any business will, you know, develop necessary shorthand, be it for saving time, efficiency, etc. As a, you know, founder of a, you know, startup, I can't tell you how many times I've been told, describe something in 300 characters or less. And sometimes that shorthand is just necessary for efficiency. You know, you use the word obfuscation instead of, you know, 3 other adjectives. It's sometimes just necessary and more efficient. And sometimes, you know, you're willing to be a little bit less accurate, or not less accurate, more accurate for the cost of being understood. But it all depends on context. You have to know your audience and who you're communicating to.
I think
that's the challenge.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that concept around the journey of cybersecurity as an industry and how it's, you know, historically been a very much a small group of very technical individuals who've typically been, if you want to look at the IT crowd analogy, in the basement. They else is doing stuff, and occasionally you'll talk to them. That's starting to change. We'll revisit that in a minute. I'm going to bring Will Dickinson, if I may, in, because I mean, Will, you know, you're new into the cybersecurity arena, a young, enthusiastic entrant with some really good stuff. But, you know, is our obsession around, is it cyber, is it information security? Does that even matter? Or is this something that actually we, the generation that had it as information security, information assurance, need to leave that behind, and the new generation just need to crack on with embracing cyber? What's your views on cyber security?
I think that's a very interesting question, Chris. So sort of coming from a non-cyber IT background, university, sort of coming into the industry, it's been quite a shock to the system. Coming in, seeing all this language being used that is what's very specialist, and I think that it's sort of like a culture where it's not particularly accessible to outsiders, because mainly necessary about the work that's being done, it's not necessarily that visible to the outside. So obviously, taking from what Andrew said, some of the language probably is necessary to describe the unique work that is being done. But I also think that maybe the generations that have been immersed in it for the past 20 years could potentially make it a little bit more accessible to those coming in. But yeah, as you said, I think some of the specific language and the inaccessible language is potentially necessary to the job being done.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think what we're starting to laser in here, now I'm going to bring Paul in a second to talk about this as well, is that maybe there's 2 different languages here. Maybe it's okay to have some fairly deep language use within the cybersecurity industry, and maybe the difficulty that we've got is that there's not a translation into the wider public domain that makes it accessible. It's a bit like, you know, I was looking at the rules of cricket, and there's that wonderful, when you're in, you go into bat, and when you're out, you go back into the pavilion where you sit out. Well, other people go in, and then they're out, and then they come in, and it just becomes a nightmare. But for somebody who's in cricket, you understand it implicitly, and somebody in cybersecurity, you're going to understand it implicitly. But if you're an outsider, that's difficult, and it's that translation angle that maybe is something that we need to look at. Paul?
Yeah, I think there's some really interesting topics here. I think for me that there's a much broader issue with you know, technology, language actually in general, and acronyms. And I think for us, it's really about understanding who your audience is and trying to pitch the language appropriately to your audience. I think that's really important, particularly when you're creating general documents like websites and things, or you're creating collateral. You know, if you're involved in a presentation, you know, at a conference or a seminar, then of course I think, you know, technical language is much more appropriate, because people are much more likely to be able to engage and understand that. But, you know, for me, I think it's really, people are making too many assumptions that the understanding is there, and I think you need to communicate understanding rather than assume understanding. And to give you an example, a couple of years ago I became governor at my daughter's school, and I think it's probably taken me around 2 years to learn the huge number of acronyms and language that's used within the school environment, so that I feel that I can be effective as a governor. I mean, I had the temerity to ask for, if you got like a glossary for all of this, these acronyms, and they looked at me as if I was an alien from another planet, saying, well, what's wrong with all these acronyms? We all understand them, but I didn't. And I felt alienated. I felt that I couldn't contribute. I felt that I couldn't engage, and I couldn't do, my role properly because I didn't understand all of the language. And for somebody that's quite happy to get up and talk to anybody about almost anything, that was a very uncomfortable experience for me. And I think we have to recognise that equally we're making other people feel uncomfortable by our use of language, by our use of terminology. And I think we need to consider that as part of the industry culture and as part of our individual organisation cultures to make sure that we try to speak in clear, simple language, but also make it fun and engaging so that that meaning is conveyed. That's the most important thing. If people don't understand, they won't engage.
Absolutely. It's absolutely got to be one of our biggest challenges is that engagement and inclusivity aspect that potentially we need to focus in on as a sector. We'll come back to that in a minute. I'm going to ask Morgan. Morgan, your background prior to joining CGI was in the defence sector, working for the army, where, let's face it, communication is an absolute need. Clarity of communication and involving the whole of the organisation, if you will, effectively. It just can't slip. What's been your observations coming into the world of cybersecurity and that difference in language use, shall we say?
So yeah, you're correct. I mean, speed of messaging to get a task complete in a kind of the minimal fuss in order to move on to the next task. The three things that I've probably taken are the pace of change in cyber. There seems to be consistently something new emerging, a new solution, and then the translation. So the translation, as me as an out-facing consultant with not really a technical background, but being able to translate what the technical people, what the clever people are telling me, and being able to translate that into a usable format to clients, and then really, by the better you can translate, the better you can kind of fine tune what the actual outcome needs to be. And I've seen innovation language get a little bit confused and a bit lost. I've also seen people hide in the language and not really understand. I think some of the points that Lauren picks up and Paul pick up, that we need to be more open, and we need to understand actually it needs to be very collaborative, because really actually the outcome is the same every time. You are seeking advantage. You can call it whatever you want. You can call it innovation. You're just trying to make things better. So the outcome, in my view, is always the same, whether you're trying to deliver a mission effect or a successful mission. The outcome's always the same. You can call it whatever you want to. You can sprinkle it with fairy dust. The outcome's still the same. So pace of change, translation between clients, consultant and the technician, and what is the actual outcome? What does good look like?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure, for CGI's clients, that communication, that very clear communication, both ways, ensures that relationship stays strong. Fantastic. Paul, I'm going to bring you in now, if I may. You've got, I know, some particular words that you don't like the use of, and think that there were better ways of communicating. Let's run through those. Give us a couple of the acronyms, buzzwords, if you like. Buzzword bingo time, Paul. What do you think?
Oh, gosh, yeah. I think that there are so many. It's difficult to pick them out. I think whenever I see acronyms, it just makes my skin crawl, if I'm to be honest. I think what we need to do is just try to recognise where acronyms add value and where they don't add value. So, there was the school example. There are some acronyms in the school governor example where they have the same acronym that mean completely different things. And so for an outsider like me, or a historical outsider, I had absolutely no clue, and it just makes my skin crawl to hear those kinds of things, because you can just see people's faces just gloss over. And I've given presentations where I've seen people's faces gloss over, and I've recognised that and been able to adapt to that particular audience. But I think one of the words I struggle with, coming out of Hub 8 and speaking to the people there, is cyber and glitch and those kind of things. What do they actually mean? Why are we using them? It almost seems that what we're trying to do is, as we move things forward, from a technology perspective, we're moving the language forward, but I think we're actually moving the language backwards, because we're not conveying that kind of understanding that's needed to get the outcomes that Morgan was talking about. Because everything that we do is about an outcome, and if that outcome is confused or opaque or misunderstood, we're going to end up with something that isn't an expected outcome. We've probably all seen those cartoons where a customer describes what they want, and then the analyst draws a picture of what the analyst thinks it wants, then designer takes it and draws something different, and then the implementation guy takes it and he comes up with something else, and then the customer gets delivered something that doesn't match what they said to the first person in the chain. I think there's the swing, I think, is a common example. So the customer just wanted a simple swing hung from a tree, but actually by the time it's implemented, it's got all kinds of supports and elastic bands and cushions and everything else. Customer just wanted a swing. And I think that's really what we need to focus on, is what is the outcome, what's the result, where do we want to get to, and how can we most efficiently get there without using words like cyber and glitch and innovation and various other acronyms.
That's really interesting, and I love that analogy, the Chinese whisper effect of how things are lost the further we go along that trail. I mean, let's Paul Earnshaw, I'm going to bring you in if I may as well, and I know you've got some really cool views around this as well. I mean, is when we're talking about cyber, what are we even talking about? Because if I talk to somebody on the street about, we work in cyber, they go, "Oh, you're a hacker then," and that's like 5% of our industry. I've got the hood up and we're all working away in blacked out windows. That's not what we're talking about. So what are we talking about when we're talking about?
That is a classic thing, isn't it? Where the terminology brings forward visions and images to people. And I think having lived through the emergence of cyber as a word and its acceptance in sort of society and usage in the media, it strikes me that a lot of the language, there's language is used for lots of different reasons, and one reason is to scare people, and certainly a lot of the cyber language has been to scare people. Now, the reason I think that the scaring is going on is because the scaring then released funds to allow things to happen. So you just scare people with language, and therefore
which sells newspapers.
Which absolutely and keeps people interested. Nobody's interested in a boring story.
Yeah.
And like you said, my annoyance at the word glitch is amazing, because I've worked in IT for 30 years, and I've called it a failure. I've called it a failure of the system, something's gone wrong, blah, blah, blah. But I've never used the word glitch to describe anything that's happened in any of my code or any of my, a glitch is a thing that happens in an electronic circuit. And it's the misappropriation of the words that are used. My other annoyance in language, and Morgan will attest to this, is around sort of fluffiness but also fluffiness where it's used for marketing effect, and it's used to almost pull the wool over people's eyes as to what they're actually talking about. My absolute favorite use of that language is in adverts for where they say it's up to 100%. It means absolutely nothing, because up to 100% is anywhere between 0 and 100%. It's a pointless statement, and that sort of thing just annoys me. And once I get annoyed, then then I start to spot other elements of it. And I've heard horrendous uses of communication in the cyber community, usually by people who don't know what they're talking about, so they try and fluff around the topic. So I think all those things are important to understand. It's mostly understanding human psychology, isn't it? It's understanding why people use the language that they use. What is their motivation?
Yeah.
Certain accountants care about money, so they talk about things in terms of school teachers care about the processes involved in schooling. Cyber people care about the things, the processes involved in cyber. Then when you get to innovation just is a big fluffy cloud of not really any precise language to try and describe it.
Yeah.
So,
innovation is a really tricky one, and it's we're not going to go on to innovation yet today, but maybe we'll come back and revisit that another time. But I really like that. So what we're finding then, I think we're all in agreement that cybersecurity suffers from use language that is elitist, that doesn't drive engagement, that doesn't drive inclusivity, and actually makes it harder for itself. So I guess in the 10 or so minutes we've got left, it'd be good to get some ideas around what can we do then to solve some of these problems. Is it whose responsibility is it? I mean, that's a key question. I'm going to bring Lauren back in, because does it start at the board? Does it start in the tech team, the whole organization? How do we solve the problem?
Gosh, if I could answer that question to everything, then I wouldn't be sat here, I doubt. No, it is a really interesting point, and I think that you have to consider, first of all, that there's a scale in terms of people's understanding. So I agree with you, Paul, about the use of the word glitch, but that actually generates a collective understanding of a very large proportion of people. And as you go up that scale, that level of understanding, there's much more education and much more expertise around it. So the terminology and the language that's used becomes much more detailed and much more technical. But I think you have to match that with exactly what your audience is. What's your marketing message? But it isn't just marketing. And I wonder if actually some of this has come from the fact that the sales process has changed. Your sales representative has changed, particularly in the cyberspace. When you go to sell to a business, and it's the same actually in technology and comms as well. Our engineers have actually become the front-facing sales representatives, because they're the ones that engender the trust in the clients, because they know what they're talking about, regardless of the fact that the client might be sat there nodding their head, not quite knowing what the terminology means. It's changed the whole sales process. And so is it the responsibility of sales? Is it the responsibility of marketing? Is it exec? I actually don't know. I don't think you can pin it on one particular area. I think it has to be a completely collaborative effort across the business, and you can't just think about how you educate and communicate externally. You also have to do it internally. You can't miss that piece. I think, in fact, probably internally is much more important than externally. But who drives and delivers that language? I think you have to kind of almost segment it into who is your audience. Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because cybersecurity is now moving towards the holistic view of an organization being secure, rather than, as we say, that siloed view of, well, the cybersecurity people will deal with that and we'll just get the report at the end of it. So we are moving towards, I think, a more collaborative view. But there's still some work to be done. I'm going to bring Will back in as well with a different perspective. Will, for your generation coming up, do you think, because there's a risk here, isn't there, in the use of language, where we don't want to dumb down the language because it's patronizing, right? You're a bright young generation who are, you're cloud native, you're tech savvy, you're up with it. Do you need that, or is there still a balance to be struck?
I think you should be writing my CV, Chris, with all these all these acronyms. So yeah, I think it's a cultural change, really, sort of within organisations, that people are becoming more aware that, as Lauren said, that cyber needs to be sort of understood at all levels, from the very boots on the ground all the way up to the board. So I think that'll improve as the newer generation come through, who have always been brought up with the better practices, shall we say, because yes, my generation has sort of always lived with the internet. I do remember dial-up, so I do sort of cling on to that. But yes, we've sort of always had that culture around. So I do think that good progress will be made. But I think, there's things that we can do now to help the incoming generation bring that culture change with it.
Well, it's so important, isn't it? I'm going to bring Andrew back in, if I may, to talk about the inclusivity angle, because we move towards, there is an absolute need in the industry, I think we can all agree, to get a more inclusive recruitment strategy in place to bring different ideas, different ways of thinking into the sector. Do we think the use of language is a real key part of that, and how can we help that inclusive agenda and break out of the elitist mentality that deep techies have probably moved towards naturally over time?
Yeah, so being in a leadership position in a company where we're often having to bring people in and kind of catch them up on the language, as it were. Even if they're from the industry, there's kind of unique language that forms within even specific sectors. So, we sit in the identity space, and that even has its own kind of unique language, unique jargon, etc. And so, I think it's really incumbent upon leaders to, we were talking about education earlier. You kind of have to agree a curriculum, as it were, and set the appropriate expectations. We've talked a lot about, thinking about your audience. You have to agree a curriculum, again, as the, deeply, you bring in the deeply technical experts, and they set, maybe a simplified version of the ultra technical language, which you then give and spoon feed to the new folks, and they digest that, and you make sure they have some level of mastery, and then you take them to the next level where it gets a little bit more technical and they get a little bit deeper, et cetera, et cetera. Again, I think this is an issue of, leadership, and also, being specific, leaders being responsible for how it's communicated down the line from the very technical to the very non-technical. You're responsible for that translation, because as we've seen in both ways, it can stay too technical and then no one knows what's being said. But it can also be oversimplified, and then it becomes inaccurate, and then we get buzzwords and acronyms that no one actually knows what it means. So, we were talking about, who's really responsible. I think ultimately it's a factor that is driven by leadership. You have to show that you care enough about your people that you're going to put in the very difficult work of developing that curriculum and language.
Absolutely, and that it's that engagement, isn't it, that I think we're talking about. So we're coming towards the end. It's becoming obvious that it's not just the responsibility of deeply technical cybersecurity professionals to upskill their ability to communicate. It's maybe there's an opportunity for individuals to act as an active buffer and a translator between the wider business or the wider community and those deeply technical teams. And we've also got an education piece from board level down into demystifying what this whole cyber thing is in the first place. But there's some really cool things I think we can do. I'm going to round off, play a little game. And I'd love to hear what your worst piece of industry jargon is that you've heard recently, and when you've kind of rolled your eyes and gone, "Oh no, I don't know what you're talking about," or "Hold on." So, who should we start with first? Why don't we start with you, Paul? Paul Harris, why don't you dive in?
Gosh, do you know what? I think it was so bad I erased it from my memory because it just annoyed me so much. It just went in one ear and out the other, and I can't remember. I remember feeling really bristled by it. So I'm sorry I can't recount what it was. But, it was just.
It was so bad. I love it.
It was just. Why are people talking like that? Because you're just causing disconnection and disengagement, and you're not going to get the right kind of outcome. I mean, I think that one of the ones that was mentioned earlier on was that up to 100%. When you see that this technology is 100% effective at doing this. Well, what does that actually mean?
Yeah, it's meaningless, isn't it? 60% of the time it works every time. It's the old acronym, isn't it? Morgan, I'm going to bring you back in. Any horror stories? Anything that you really gets your go?
Not so much I think it's just the way in which it's delivered. From a consultant to client, consistently the client will come in and they've already got what they think is the technological solution. So they'll come in and talk AI, and then I'll go and talk to Paul Earnshaw, and he'll quickly tell me it's not AI at all. Again, it's that translation. So that's really where the language is constantly being compromised, and it needs to be clarified and fine-tuned.
Yeah, absolutely. Paul Earnshaw?
Yeah, well, Morgan's picked on one of my favourites, which is the definition of AI. I read this morning a definition of AI that said it's simply if a machine can do something smart and clever, and you go, well, that's a calculator. You know, I mean, multiplying two very large numbers together is efficiently smart and clever. So that you've just defined a calculator. There's also this sort of the creeping language that's used, and I've seen an element of it recently in management meetings. The management should remain unnamed, but they keep asking whether it's a binary yes or a binary no. And you think, well, what's the point of adding the word binary to yes and no? It doesn't actually add anything to it. It's, you know, but they keep saying, yeah, is that a binary yes or a binary no? You know, and you go, well, if it's not, then it's something in the middle, and that's not yes or no. So that's a maybe. You know, and so yeah, that's just the sort of stuff that just puts my my sort of the hairs on the back of my neck go, ooh, you know, we shouldn't be using language like that. It's
so important, because key leadership, you know, bad use of language, misuse of language and jargons can do much. It can be so damaging to you, because you've got people in your team who are literally rolling their eyes, going, "Why have you said that? That's." I know you had some fun with this. Anything that sticks out in your mind?
Was that me? Sorry, Chris,
Yeah,
I couldn't hear. Yeah, sorry, I couldn't hear you say my name then. There's a couple of things, I think. Not necessarily cyber, but cloud has always been something that's bugged me. The introduction of cloud as a buzzword, I couldn't understand how people suddenly jumped all over that like nothing had ever existed before it, even though we'd been sending each other emails for the previous 15 years. So yeah, that's something that's always bugged me. But I think there's another thing as well here, which is there's so many acronyms, and the human brain automatically, when you hear an acronym, it attaches itself to the thing that you heard that there was the most similar to it last. And there was one recently, which is a business group that's been put together, and its acronym was very similar to Her Majesty's Prison Service. And when I was reading through something that was sent to me, my brain kept going to prisons. What? So yeah, I find that quite interesting. There's too many acronyms, and yeah, your human brain just takes you where you don't want to go sometimes. So yeah, the simplicity of not using an acronym is probably far better.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. So we've got some really key takeaways from today. It's been an absolute pleasure. But you know, if we're going to build an inclusive cybersecurity business function that involves and embraces the organization and moves towards a relational relationship rather than purely transactional, it's about use of language. But that language can't be just down to the internal security teams. It's also about the wider business actively looking to engage and demystify this whole thing called cybersecurity. It's such a cool industry, and it's been an absolute pleasure speaking to all of you today. Just remains for me to thank you for your time. We'll be back again for another insightful panel session, I'm sure, with CGI, CyNam's gold sponsor for this year, later on this quarter. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.